Yeah, we back now, man. Part two. As you know, I believe it was yesterday or today, I dropped a video entitled The Memoirs of Jean-Jacques Dessalines' secretary, a gentleman who goes by the name of Boisrond-Tonnerre. This was Dessalines' right-hand man, right? He died at the age of 30 years old, but even though he lived a short life, he left us some legendary literature for us to enjoy, man. Listen, this book came out in 1804. If you watch part one, you already know, but this book came out in 1804. This is a memoir of the Haitian Revolution directly from someone who was involved in it. And if you haven't seen part one, I encourage you, don't start at part two, go to part one, or nothing is going to make sense. In part one, we gave the introduction, we introduced the central figure, we gave a brief life story, a brief account on how he came up, his childhood, his background, everything like that. And in part one of the memoirs, we read how the French had just landed in the colony, right? The French had just landed in the north, they took control of the north, Dessalines going up against Rochambeau, Dessalines running up in the town of Crête-à-Pierrot, slaughtering all the whites, Christophe setting the capital city on fire. Man, listen. Go to part one, action packed. Let's jump right into part two, not wasting no time. Let's go. However, Dessalines was busy fortifying himself at Crête-à-Pierrot. He assembled the guns there that General Vernet dragged to Cahors, where it would have been impossible for him to mount them, filled his powder magazines with ammunition, and about reared the fort with the wide ditch which it lined with a thick row of thorns. The troops he had with him were reduced to a few companies of the Guard of Honor, a battalion from Gonaive, 300 men who had followed him from Saint-Marc, and 100 gunners. Finally, his force was made up only of 700 men, including a few National Guardsmen, under the leadership of Battalion Commander Pierre Coutreau, a mortal enemy of the French. It was with this handful of men that Dessalines awaited the united divisions of French General Leclerc and Rochambeau, Boudet, and Hardy. These forces were still supported by the 9th Demi Brigade, the battalion of the 13th under the orders of Bardet, and that coming from Barahunda. This corps was entrusted only to the adjutant commandant, Petron, a man of color. Wow, you see that? Alexander Petron was fighting on the side of the French at that time. Bitch ass fuck nigga. Anyways, let's continue. Alexander Petron distinguished himself by his knowledge of the artillery, by courage superior to all events, and above all, by the greatest coolness. He had served in Rigaud's army, and he had followed Rigaud to France. Back in Santo Domingo with the squadron, this officer had been received by the country's troops with the veneration they had preserved for him, and the attachment that his compatriots had for him did not escape him. Dessalines had scarcely had time to fortify himself in haste when he was informed by some scouts whom he had still had in the plain that the 4 French divisions were currently advancing. This eminence, commonly known as Crête-à-Pierrot, is located at the end of a long chain of hills on the right bank of the Artibonite, which flows within 2 rifle ranges of this post, which can be considered as the lowest part of the chain, which dominates it from one end to the other. Dessalines had furnished his fort with field guns, a few 8-pounders and a 2 12-pounders. The French advanced first from the side of the town, and when they were within cannon range, Dessalines lowered the gate to the fort. Soldiers, Dessalines said, with the energy he always puts into his speeches. These doors are lowered for those who are not resolved to die. While there is still time for the friends of the French to leave now, they have only hope here for death. And after having allowed those driven out by disease or fear to withdraw, Dessalines opens the doors of a powder magazine, takes a barrel of powder, spreads it to the first door, and seizes a burning ember. There it is, he said, for the last fire. Dessalines says, "I'll blow up the fort if you don't fight back." Everybody then runs to their post and waits for the enemy. At the same moment, a man from the French ranks advances. He is carrying a letter, which he holds raised between his fingers. He stops a few steps from the fort and asks to hand it over. Dessalines orders to fire. The French representative is then killed by a cannonball. It was then that the fire began with a stubbornness, a relentlessness, which announced on the side of the fort the contempt for life, and on that of the French the desire to seize the first position, which had once again offered such courageous resistance to their attacks. A swarm of French, led by more than 20 general officers, surrounded the fort and rained down a hail of cannonballs, bombs, and bullets and shells on a handful of 700 men resolved to die. They seized the eminence that Dessalines had not had time to fortify, and from there put the majority of our gunners out of action. While Dessalines encourages his people, the columns posted on the side of the town advance and are already in the ditches. The danger increases, the gunners redouble their efforts and repel all that approach. Already, there are no more intervals between the noise of the musketry and the artillery. It's a rolling fire. The French returned to the charge. Our small guns grew hot. Several jumped and hastily made openings, crumbled, and no longer offered the gunners sufficient shelter. Dessalines orders that the guns be dragged to the middle of the fort. A soldier has them charged and presents them one by one to the embrasures, which are still resisting. Unnecessary care. The ditches are filled with the French. Our discouraged gunners, mingling with the infantry, are trying to take cover. A few companies set off and desert the ramparts. The fort seemed stripped. Dessalines flew to the powder keg, armed with the burning brand that he had not abandoned, and went to make the promise to blow up the entire fort when he noticed that the enemy was coming without precaution and hitting at the embrasures. With the same ember, he sets fire to the guns, and aided by a single gunner who was still at his side, he drags a piece of 4 and sweeps away the troops who are already in the fort. His people regained courage, flew back to the ramparts, and the fight began again with more passion. The French fled and went back to the town of Petit Rivière. A piece of 8 from the fort aimed at the main road continually plays on the troops which appear there. It is no longer possible for the enemy to stay in the houses of the town. It was then that we saw 200 men present themselves in the open and expose themselves to all of our fire to attract our attention, and by this means give time to the columns to defile in the high road where the fire of our artillery was currently directed. This method succeeded and cost the lives of 200 of our men. The fight had started at 7 o'clock in the morning, and it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon when the French withdrew, leaving behind their dead and their wounded. General Dessalines, realizing that the enemy was really beating a retreat, but that several bands of stragglers were slowly retreating towards the town of Petit Rivière, ordered the National Guard battalion commander to come out with 60 men of his army. Troops out of the fort pursue the stragglers. The commander executes Dessalines' orders, makes a horrible butchery of what he finds, and returns after having completed the rout of the enemy. Thus ended this day, the shame of the French. This day, when 18 of their generals were wounded or killed, and when more than 5,000 of theirs remained on the square, where 700 men saw flee in less than 6 hours, more than 15,000 men of the greatest nation in the world, according to Napoleon and General Charles Leclerc. Certainly, the conduct of the French army belied in a way humiliating for this supposed great nation the sumptuous proclamation of the first consul Bonaparte, whose anger was to devour the rebels, similar to how fire devours the withered canes. Now, time out. I believe we are talking about the legendary Battle of Crête-à-Pierrot. Man, this battle, like he said, that's absolute fact. Many high-ranking generals, I'm talking about legendary generals that's like got monuments in France, they were killed. They were killed in this motherfucking battle, bro. Charles Dugois, French General Charles Dugois, who went to Egypt, who went to Africa, all those legendary campaigns, serving for the French. Killed that bitch ass nigga. Dessalines sent that nigga to hell. Fuck that nigga. Fuck. Man, listen, let me stop. Let's keep it professional. But just know, yes, the Battle of Crête-à-Pierrot, a lot of high-ranking French generals got shot, nigga. They got killed, nigga. Yeah. Now let's continue. General Dessalines foresaw with reason that the French, although beaten, would return to the charge, and he was not a little surprised that the enemy had retired to the town of Saint-Marc and the surrounding area, and gave him time to repair the fortification, in which it was absolutely impossible for him to maintain if he did not relieve them. He had also perceived the advantage the enemy had over the small eminence which overlooked the fort of La Crête-à-Pierrot, and established a redoubt there where he surrounded with a ditch similar to that of the great fort, raised the ramparts of the latter, and entrusted the new battery to General Lamartinière, who had entered it with 200 men. After giving his orders in case of a new attack, he leaves with some dragoons and goes to visit the ammunition he had hidden in the Playsac district under the care of one of his aides-de-camp. It was only 8 days after the first attack that the French, recovered from the first terror, reappeared at Fort Crête-à-Pierrot and resumed another attack where they seemed determined to seize the post. Dessalines had not yet returned, but he could count on the officers he had left in the fort. General Lamartinière was vigorously attacked. 4 field guns were still approaching, but the fire from the fort was so well directed that the enemy was obliged to abandon his guns. The great fort defended us with as much intrepidity as the first affair. The enemy, foreseeing that it would be useless to attempt another assault as long as the fort existed, took advantage of the darkness of the night and dragged along as best they could the 4 guns they had been forced to abandon, and resumed the next day, advancing towards the fort. The breach is already made in such a way that Lamartinière is forced in his turn to return to the main fort, where he bears the reassurance and firmness that he inspires in the absence of Dessalines. For 6 days, we fought on both sides without breaks, and on the 6th, Dessalines had reached a short distance from the fort. Resolved to shut himself up there, he ordered a soldier to visit the surroundings of the fort, to penetrate as far as to Lamartinière, and to bring him back the answer. Lamartinière lacked water. He informed the general, who sent him back a ring that he always wore on his finger. He knew the surroundings of the fort and decided to evacuate and fall on a strong guard that stood in his way, guarding the water the enemy foresaw he would need. As soon as he believed the hour favorable, he went out at the head of his soldiers, broke through the guard, dispersed it before giving it time to recognize, took 6 prisoners, crossed the water, and carried the terror to the quarter, where French General Rochambeau was hiding in the darkness, and took the peak and plunged into the woods. General Lamartinière had joined Dessalines, who took the road to the town of Machan, a town where he had beaten the English several times and where he was waiting for the French. Crête-à-Pierrot had destroyed the great scarecrow of the French, and the black soldiers, proud of Dessalines' resistance, rallied passionately around him. It was at this time that a vessel and 2 battalions of the Rigaud and the Chasseurs de la Loi were sent to one of the southern ports. These troops sufficed in a quarter where the black general La Plume was completely devoted to the French government, and where the people, always friends of novelty, impatiently awaited a new order of things. A brigade commander, a man of color, listened to by La Plume, had persuaded him to receive the French troops, and had succeeded in having this general arrest the various commanders who had shown themselves devoted to the cause of the country, and who had received orders to set fire to the towns and to oppose the entry of the French into this department. A warm friend of Europeans, he only surrounded himself of themselves alone, and inspired his feelings in La Plume, a monster that no adjective is significant enough to characterize. Adjutant General Dabois had just been sent as commander to Jérémy, replacing the black brigade leader Dommage, whom we had great difficulty to prevent Jérémy from burning, and whom Dabois had arrested a few days before his installation. Finally, taking possession of the South had not cost France a single man. Now, time out. Like I said before, the South was always a territory that was controlled and commanded by the mixed race generals, the mulatto generals. And honestly, man, to be honest, what can you really expect when your father is a white man? When your father is a white man, obviously the weak link is gonna be the motherfucker who his father is a fucking white man. So I'm sorry, bro. I'm sorry. A lot of people don't like to talk about that. But when your father is a white man, how can I count on you to fight for black liberation? I'm sorry to tell you, bro. It is what it is, bro. It is what it is. Like I said, you heard it. You heard it from himself. You heard it in the book himself. The French did not even lose a single man, and they took possession of the South. The French conquered the southern regions without a single shot being fired, without a single battle being fought. Contrast that with what happened in the north, where Christophe was commanding. The whole fucking city got burned down to the ground. Every white resident was fucking kidnapped and brought into the woods and was threatened with murder. Christophe told the French general, listen, if you make one false move, I'm burning the town to the ground and I'm gonna cut every single one of their fucking throats. Compare that with what happened in the South. Nigga, ain't nothing got burned, ain't nobody got shot, ain't nobody got slapped, ain't nobody got hurt. And listen, this is off topic, but that is the reason why Haiti had to pay the $20 billion to the French slaveholders in 1825, because in 1825, a man of mixed race who goes by the name of General Jean-Pierre Boyer, whose father was a fucking white man, he decided that he was going to agree to pay the French slaveholders $20 billion as reparations. Yes. So at the end of the day, what can you expect from a man whose father is a goddamn white man? It is what it is. Your father's a white man. Obviously, you're going to fucking act like a white man. Anyways, let's continue. Unless you're Baron-Tonnerre. Unless you're the exception to the rule, like Baron-Tonnerre, like Christophe's secretary, Baron de Vasti. But the vast majority of them, Andre Rigaud, traitor. As you can see on the motherfucking, in the memoir, Andre Rigaud was fighting against the Haitians during this time. We mentioned that earlier in the memoir. Andre Rigaud was fighting against Dessalines in that first encounter that we mentioned earlier in the book. Alexander Pétion was fighting against the French at this time. Like I said, bro, it is what it is. I'm not angry. I'm just telling you the facts, right? I'm just telling you the facts. It doesn't matter if your mother is a black woman. If your father's a white man, 9 times out of 10, you're going to follow in the footsteps of your father because that's the man you admire. It's human nature. It's human nature. Everything I got, my whole mentality, everything I got came from my father. So I'm not upset at the behavior of the mixed race generals in the South. It's what's expected. I expected them to comport themselves in the way they did. I expected them to give up the entire southern province without firing a shot. I expected them to agree to pay $20 billion to the French slaveholders, because guess what? Those French slaveholders were also their fathers, their grandfathers, their uncles, their cousins. It is what it is. It is what it is. It's family business, baby. It's family business. You see, I don't got no blood connection to no white man, so I don't feel no affection for no white man. How the mixed race brothers in Haiti during the revolution had felt for their white fathers and their white ancestors. It is what it is. Let's continue. Taking possession of the South had not cost France a single man, so things were left to subsist there for some time on the same footing as they had been found. Owners of Crête-à-Pierrot, it seemed that the French had nothing more to fight, and everything continued to impose on their part the troops of the country. Discouraged by the softness of some of their generals, for 8 days, Dessalines had been at the town of Machan in a state of languor and illness, which made the people fall into despair for his life. The French columns traversed, with an imprudent security, the mountains of Cahors, which led them to the attraction of the pillage and the desire to seize the treasures which they had believed there to be hidden. It was in these wandering races that the French had tortured the black farmers to force them to discover the place where Dessalines had allegedly buried his treasures. There, the women and children were victims to the greed of the French soldiers who, with the utmost inhumanity, tore off their ears with the earrings they wore. The necklace, a handkerchief, became the price of a gunshot, and if it happened that a frightened farmer went deep into the woods, he was immediately shot dead or bound and sent to the town of Saint-Marc to be put there to death. Everybody was considered as an enemy combatant, and none ever found grace, unless fear of death made him promise to lead some detachment to a place where he knew there was money hidden. So, no caresses, no promises were not made to him. If he succeeded in discovering the cherished metal, in the first days where these unfortunates were led without precautions under the guard of some soldiers, always having the agent of some generals in mind, and when the unfortunate farmer or soldier had led them into some precipice, he rushed there and gained by ways which he had practiced for the first time, the mountains of Machan. Subsequently, the French strangled to death these unfortunate victims of their greed. General Dessalines' illness was getting worse. Now, time out. Keep in mind, we're talking about women and children and farmers and innocent people who are not involved in the war. And because the French are looking for whatever buried treasure, Dessalines' money or treasure or whatever they're looking for, they out here ripping people's ears off, they strangling people to death, they stabbing people to death, they shooting people to death, and, you know, y'all want to go to Paris and go to the Eiffel Tower and shit like that. It is what it is. Let's continue. Dessalines' illness was getting worse. The frightened soldier, who foresaw in the death of his chief the crowning glory of his misfortunes, occupied himself only in consulting those who approached him about his condition. Several soldiers were seen advancing towards his bed, questioning him, and when weakness did not allow him to encourage them, they withdrew, putting their hands on their heads, a sign of the greatest tenderness among the blacks. "We are lost," they cried. "General Toussaint is abandoning us, and our father is going to die." Little by little, his good constitution and his sobriety saved him. He was still weak when asked to review his troops that remained to him. What was his surprise and indignation when only 60 men could be mustered? He seized his 2 pistols, with vivacity, burned the brains of the first 2 captains who were in front of him, and threatened to exterminate the officer who in 24 hours would not have assembled his company. This action of a resolute leader had its effect. 4 days had not elapsed before he saw himself at the head of 5,000 armed men, burning with the desire to avenge themselves. Toussaint, while this was going on in the West, by dint of solicitations on the part of Captain General Leclerc, had decided to send General Christophe to him. While waiting, he said that he could bring back to submission. General Dessalines and General Charles Belair were still fighting with him. Christophe was indeed the right man on this occasion to reveal the conduct of the new government, but the Captain General had taken all his measures to show off all the appearances of justice and fraternity. César Telemaque, a black man, had been appointed by him the mayor of the capital to reward him for the attachment he had shown for the French. Coon ass nigga. By opposing the fire with all his means and by haranguing the people on arrival, General Christophe was deceived by these false appearances of contempt of prejudice and returned to the governor with the well-circumstantial account of what he had seen. The reply, or rather the treaty, made between the clerk and him. Toussaint leaves, goes to Dessalines, and complains of having been abandoned by General Christophe. "I know this general too well," replied Dessalines, "to do him for a moment the injustice of believing that he entered the capital without your orders. Act with me without disguise, and simply tell me that you submit to the French government." Toussaint then gives Leclerc's letter, which he claims not to have read. "It's impossible," replied Dessalines. "You know the content. Who gave you this letter?" "Christophe," replied Toussaint. "Why did you not have him arrested and punished since he entered the capital without your orders?" Dessalines said. And on the spot, he reads it, protesting to Toussaint that he makes him responsible for the misfortunes that he is going to bring on his compatriots by his softness, that as for him, he will never believe himself guilty towards them since he will only obey his orders. Toussaint leaves on the pretext of having going to have Christophe arrested, if there is still time, but ends up going to French General Leclerc. If the blindness in which his confidence in the French government had plunged him had allowed him to see clearly, he soon realized that he was welcomed rather like a rebel who was feared and congratulated on having attracted into the trap, than as a useful citizen who was praised for having brought back the good cause. Dessalines did not believe that the troubles were over. Dessalines was still fighting, and Toussaint had spoke of his stubbornness in not laying down his arms and of the confidence the troops had in him. If it were necessary to subjugate this general by the way of arms, the war might last a long time still. To bring him back by persuasion, only Toussaint was seen to be able to do so. We therefore redoubled our attention to the latter. We loaded him with honors, with promises, and we made him see that the resistance he had made until then, far from diminishing, that the government had conceived of it, its conduct had only served to show more evidently its love for the liberty of its country. While submission to the French would be the most convincing proof that the agents of the government acted towards the generals of Saint-Domingue as the first consul intended, Toussaint used all of his means he believed effective to bring Dessalines back to the party he has embraced. It was useless. The latter, outraged with the indignation at Toussaint's conduct, ranged his troops against the town of Machan, astonished at the governor's resolution. "You see," Dessalines told them, "that the general-in-chief is doomed. Do you want to imitate him or perish like me, arms in hand? There are only 2 courses left for us to take, freedom or death. Under the French, humiliation and death awaits us, but here we will die free, but with honor and integrity." Those whom Toussaint's conduct had cooled for the cause of the country regained courage and all swore never to submit to the French. Therefore, addressing himself to a small number of officers who were intimate with him, he told them that his project was to attract General Toussaint to a conference under the pretext of wishing to make arrangements for the safety of his person, of the arrest and confine him under the supervision of a guard, and to decide on the battlefield whether the country should remain with the French. Everyone approves of it. Then Dessalines wrote to Toussaint that, still ignorant of the conduct of the Captain General toward those who submitted to him, he wanted to be instructed by himself of the particularities which had preceded his entry into the capital, and of those which had followed. Either that the latter had not been informed of the project, or that he was not allowed to go to the rendezvous, he contented himself with sending him one of his officers. Toussaint's letter, of which this officer was the bearer, said in substance that freedom had never been on the eve of being so well consolidated as since the arrival of the French, that the Captain General could be considered as the restorer of the rights for which they had so long fought, and whom he engaged, even allowed him to contribute by his submission to the prompt execution of the good intentions of the Captain General. This letter changing nothing in Dessalines' disposition, Toussaint resolved to work the army secretly through the officers he frequently sent to the Machan camp. And as soon as he thought the moment favorable, he left the capital, fired a few gunshots as a sign of rejoicing, and shouted, "Peace, peace, peace." The soldiers, either by remnant of obedience for this chief or by the seduction that had been employed, submit and asked to return to the town of Saint-Marc. Dessalines, devouring his wrath, made a virtue of necessity and went to their head at Saint-Marc. It was therefore for his troop, or rather by the desire to preserve it from the horrors he foresaw, that Dessalines appeared submissive, but he still kept in his heart the project of raising the standard of insurrection as soon as the French gave him the pretext. Impartial reader, you are going to judge who made the executioners and who were the victims. Toussaint, on returning to the capital, tried to carry there the imposing and proud tone which a chief who had sold his mission dearly retains, had removed from him his officers whom the French were able to win over by procuring them a rapid advancement. Toussaint was alone, isolated, without advice, and gave, in a word, a weak opinion of character, which the French supposed him to have. Dessalines, on the contrary, had entered the town of Saint-Marc, not with that dejected air which a defeated enemy wears, but with that confident countenance of a leader who makes himself feared even when he submits. The joy that the people in the French army felt and showed was the finest tribute paid to their military talents, their bravery, and their constancy. One saw in him the scaled chief who fixed the fears and the terror of the French. We had nothing more to doubt about Toussaint Louverture. It was easy to see that he was not the soul of the armies of the country, and that Toussaint was no longer regarded without Dessalines, except as a counterfeit version of a general-in-chief. He was celebrated, regaled, and every French general wanted to see him. Damn, time out. Boisrond-Tonnerre, in this book, he said that without Dessalines, Toussaint is nothing but a fraud, a fake, a phony, a counterfeit general-in-chief. Damn, bro. Boisrond-Tonnerre basically said, Toussaint, you just a bitch-ass nigga without Dessalines. Damn, bro. Anyways, let's continue. He received from each congratulations for any other than for a man who, like him, joined the anxiety of the guinea fowl to the finesse of the fox, never dried up on one side the praises due to the defender of la Crête-à-Pierrot, who henceforth would help the government restore order in the countryside. The 4th Demi Brigade, of which he had been colonel, a troop which he had never left, which in all the campaigns he carried out always served as vanguard, the breastplate for his division, had returned to Saint-Marc, or tried to corrupt it, but this body was unshakable to seductions. However, it was feared, and no better expedient was found than by dispersing the soldiers and enlisting them in different French corps. This corps submitted to the incorporation, but never wanted to leave Saint-Marc or abandon its general, and it was decided to make it the 3rd Battalion of the 5th Light, the best troop that the French had then. But the black soldiers considered themselves nonetheless like the 4th Colonel Demi Brigade, and the spirit of the new corps into which they had just been incorporated did not change anything in their character. Of people accustomed only to obey only the orders of Dessalines and ready to follow him again into the woods, we see what interest the government had in accommodating troops who, in their submission, were no less formidable, and the Captain General seemed for some time to adopt measures of mildness, which I believe suited his character. But with him, or to put it better, since his arrival in Santo Domingo had come out of England, from the continent of America, from Jamaica, and from the other islands. A peat of those tigers called colonists, crazy people, crushed from their debts, and which returned to the colony of Saint-Domingue only in order to extort a few portions of goods from the numerous victims whom it had been promised to immolate to their pride, to their greed, and to pay on the small number of blacks and yellows attached to the French party, all the contempt with which they had been covered in foreign countries. Vile supporters of the new authority, those intriguers endeavored to inspire in Leclerc the vampirism of which they had been made a profession under the old regime, and persuaded him that his authority would never be firmly established except for partial insurrections would always disturb the order he wanted to establish in the countryside if he did not take harsh measures against the blacks who could not be only frightened by the most horrible tortures. One of these people, who was the leader of the Captain General, the chief executioner, was a certain man by the name of Colette. He resided in the capital, where he supported the operations of the government. He had joined a few immigrants, intriguers, and other people of this description, who maintained with their equals from other departments a correspondence which treated only of the means of destroying the black class. It was on the occasion of some insurrections which took place in the mountains where the peaceful blacks were disarmed that the government, at the instigation of these killers, ordered the erection of gallows in some of the principal towns. And from then on, each village cut its gallows. Even in the Department of the South, which had not yet given the example of the slightest discontent, they secretly pursued there the former military chiefs who had not even been employed under the government of Toussaint Louverture, but who had served under Rigaud. We had not yet found any possible pretext for dismissing the latter, as long as the insurrections lasted, but as soon as Dessalines had submitted, the opportunity was watched, which presented itself in the following manner. Since the departure of Saint-Domingue of this ex-general from the South, his property had been confiscated, and neither his family nor his proxies had been able to obtain the release of the property. General La Plume had appropriated most of his fortune and was staying in his house. It was natural, on his return, Rigaud made a claim to the commander of his department for what belonged to him, and that he warned him that in the event that he refused to satisfy the justice of his request, he would instruct the Captain General. La Plume, foreseeing the embarrassment in which he would throw him, the necessity of restoring, took the advice of the colonists who surrounded him, and it was decided by all people interested in removing Rigaud from the town of Lecay that La Plume should complain to the government of the stubbornness of General Rigaud, who had no sooner set foot in Santo Domingo than he was busy insulting a general whom he hated because he showed attachment to the whites by his prompt submission at the orders of the French government. That moreover Rigaud was at least suspected of inciting his former partisans to revolt in the South. Some insurrections had already broken out, and that he, La Plume, could not answer for the tranquility of the South as long as no means were found to prevent Rigaud's agents from entering it. They eagerly seized this opportunity to make sure of this general, who they feared would unite with some black chiefs. Rigaud was leaving France, where he had enjoyed little consideration until the moment when he had been destined to return to the colony of Saint-Domingue, when he was reserved to become one of the instruments of the division, if the southern part revolted like the other departments. Moreover, as few troops had been sent to this department while La Plume had the regiment he had commanded when he was only a colonel, it was feared that he would do a great deal of harm in a part which had been preserved until then intact, if he were put under the necessity of splitting with the French. All these motives joined to the resolution to get rid of Rigaud, induced the Captain General to embark him. This one was in Saint Marc. General, he said to Rigaud, I'm going to make a tour in the south. You will come with me, you will embark. Rigaud tells him how happy he is to see his country again and dispatches one of his officers to the capital to warn his wife to go to the town of Lecaille. Rigaud embarks. The order had already been given. The captain of the ship sailed for the capital. Rigaud, astonished, asks where he is going. To the capital, answers the sea jailer. And having arrived in front of this port, as Rigaud was preparing to descend, this captain informed him of the order to halt, which he was carrying. This general therefore remained outside, where he barely had time to send to pick up his wife. Fortunately, she had not left for the town of Lecaille. Now, time out. I believe many people don't know, but Toussaint Louverture, yes, he was also captured by the French and arrested and sent away. But another general by the name of Rigaud, a mixed race general from the south, who back in 1799 had a civil war against Toussaint Louverture. I mentioned that earlier, and of course Rigaud fucking lost. He had to go back to France, and he came back with the French army again in 1802. And guess what? They tricked him as well, and they locked him up as well. He also got sent to jail too. Yes, the mixed race mulatto general from the south, the mulatto mixed race man from the south. Yes, he was obeying his father, fighting on the side of his father, fighting on the side of the French. And guess what? They sent his bitch ass to jail. They sent that fuck nigga to jail. Yeah. You want to side with the French? You want to side with the Europeans? You want to side with your daddy? Guess what? They don't even love you either, nigga. They don't love you either, bitch ass nigga. It is what it is. Anyways, let's continue. Matter of fact, we could wrap up part 2 right here. We could get it back started on part 3 again. So yeah, man, it is what it is. It's your boy Jean-Jacques Dessalines back in the building. Yes, indeed. Like, share, subscribe, Cash App in the description, and I'm gone. Peace.